welcome. You are here, I promise, for Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. However, Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed continues to come up. So Tablet Magazine, yesterday was the 13th, published yesterday an article by Eric Lowy. Eric Lowy is a professor he's a professor of biblical interpretation, but his real thing is medieval Jewish philosophy. And he published this article in Tablet that is sort of an abridgment, summarization, whatever you want to call it, of a book that he's recently written about Rashi as a biblical commentator. And what's interesting about this particular article is he essentially takes the Guide of the Perplexed and its way of interpreting the Tanakh and poses it up against Rashi as alternative methods of interpretation. One more traditional, one more rationally oriented, and kind of tries to say that the Sephardic tradition is a little more rationally oriented, at least at this stage in the game. And this is sort of in the broader scope of things interesting because Rashi is the commentator that if you're studying in a traditional context, that's who you turn to when you're reading anything from the biblical text and anything in the Talmud, because his commentaries for a number of reasons are just, you can't really understand what the Talmud says without Rashi's commentary. And he identifies a lot of things that are trouble points for people reading the biblical text. He doesn't necessarily answer them the way we would answer the trouble points, but he spots a lot of them himself. So Maimonides keeps coming up because in this article, he's essentially saying, Eric Lowy is essentially saying, well, Maimonides was the answer from the Sephardic world to Rashi. So I thought I'd show this so that you knew it was out there, and that we were kind of getting, it still comes up in modern Jewish life. Tablet is ostensibly, at least, aimed at a younger Jewish audience, ostensibly. But we are here for Guide of the Perplexed, and we're going to do it in 2 parts, this week and next week. And then the last week of the month, we'll kind of go through the Torah portions for July. So here we are, Guide of the Perplexed, part 1. We are not, this is going to seem like a strange strategy, but hang in there with me. We are not going to see a huge amount of the guide today. We are going to actually not really pass page 18 in the translation into English, because the introductory material is actually really, really important. This is not the typical introduction to a book. Much of the scholarship on Maimonides centers on exactly what he means in his introduction and how that keys in with the rest of the material. So we're going to spend tonight on these first 18 pages, primarily. We'll talk a little bit about modern scholarship on Maimonides as well, because there are competing theories for what Maimonides is trying to do. But without the introduction, you can't understand any of what's happening. And we'll have to parse out what's in the introduction, because I know we're going to run up against words that I know what he's saying and probably nobody else will, or very few people will readily recognize what he's up to. So as I was mentioning, we're going to really just spend today on the introduction and the epistolary dedication, which is before the introduction, but also actually really important as a part of this text. So our goals are going to be being familiar with the outline and the structure of the guide, and it turns out that the guide itself doesn't provide much of a structure, not an explicit one that you could easily identify. Gain familiarity with the purposes of the guide and recognize the difficulties of interpreting it, which are many, and examine representative sections. So we'll spend more time examining representative sections next week, but we're going to go not quite line by line through the introduction, but we're going to hit important parts of the introduction to kind of understanding the project. Because the project is not necessarily what you have been led to believe it to be. if what you've been told is Maimonides is a huge Jewish rationalist, I guess I'm going to pop that balloon for you a little bit today. So what we'll look at tonight is the epistolary dedicatory, which is a letter that he wrote to a student explaining why he was writing the Guide of the Perplexed, and the introduction to part one, which is really the introduction to the whole thing. And we're going to take, I'm going to call them philosophical pauses or philosophical breaks, where we'll kind of unpack things that are in the text itself. Before we get going, some people like to own the texts, which I can understand. There are two widely available English translations. One of them is from 1904. It is in the public domain. You can go online and download it as a PDF, a scan. You can go to bookstores when they are open and buy a copy for like 10 bucks, because basically you get charged for the printing cost and the upcharge for a profit. So if you go to a Barnes & Noble store, you sometimes find a Barnes & Noble edition of the Guide of the Perplexed. It's not the Barnes & Noble edition of the Guide of the Perplexed. It's this edition it's this edition translated by Friedlander in 1904. And it is in the public domain. You can download it, you can buy it for not so much. The more recent one from 1963 is written by Shlomo Pinez. It is a 2-volume work. Two volumes, one is mustard yellow and one is somewhere between green and blue, I guess. And it starts with as it says here, a long 123-page long introductory essay by Leo Strauss. If you'd never encountered Leo Strauss before, he was a philosopher of modernity who questioned what philosophy could actually do in establishing universal moral truths. He is also known for a book called Persecution and the Art of Writing, which he focused on Maimonides, Baruch Spinoza, and an earlier predecessor to Maimonides, Yehuda Halevi, who is more known for poetry by a lot of people than anything else, but he wrote a book called the Kuzari that attempts to prove how Judaism is true. You know, his version of Judaism. I'll be using the Pinez translation because it's more recent and not as pulled down by the weight of its language. It is pulled down by the weight of its language. If you don't want to pay $20 a volume, if you really want stuff from this translation, and you don't want to pay $20 a volume for the Kindle edition, or $70 for the whole set. It wasn't $70 when I bought it 23 years ago. If you want to own chunks of it, including the stuff that we'll be talking about tonight, there's a book called A Maimonides Reader, edited by Isidor Tversky, but though it's pronounced Tversky, though it's written Tversky. Tversky was a Maimonides scholar at Harvard. And it is in fact the article that I showed earlier from Eric Lowy. Eric Lowy was Tversky's last dissertation advisee before Tversky died. So there's, you know, there's genetic kind of stuff between those guys. But what Tversky does is he collects in this book big chunks of the Guide of the Perplexed from the Pinez translation, but also lots and lots and lots of parts of the Mishneh Torah, that code of law that we talked about last week. And then some other letters. There's a letter on astrology and a letter to the Jews of Yemen and a few other things. So if you need a volume of Maimonides stuff, get that. Don't go by the Pinez translation from University of Chicago Press. You'll get more stuff out of the 1-volume translation, out of the 1-volume thing from Tversky. And it's $28 in paperback, more or less. Okay, so having said that, I'll be using Tversky, and that you can get, not Tversky, that it will be using Pinez, and that you can get the chunks that I'll be using from the Tversky anthology. Let's talk structure of the guide. When you actually pick this thing up, how is it put together? Physically, it's divided into 3 parts. Generally, we refer to the 3 parts as with Roman numerals, and then it's got a number of chapters, and we use Arabic numerals for the chapters. So 170 is part 1, chapter 70, 3, part 3, chapter 3, etc. Just as a, okay, here's what it looks like when you are kind of citing it. There are a couple of ways of looking at it, and you can look at the structure of this thing as 3 parts. Part 1 is, for lack of a better way of putting it towards, an analysis of the language used to discuss divine matters. This is actually what Maimonides says he's setting out to do, is clarify what traditional Jewish language about God is actually saying. Formal part 2 is an analysis of the existence of God and the nature of revelation. So this is where we get the discussions about, you may have heard the idea of the via negativa, the idea that you talk about God using positive language, but what you're really saying is the inverse of the positive thing. So God is one means God is not plural. Okay, we'll look at that in detail next week, but that's where you get some of these quote unquote classic things. And then part 3 is an analysis of the nature of creation and action, both divine and human. So what does it take to become perfect, and what is the Torah about, things like that. Leo Strauss, in his introduction to the thing, says, actually, it's really only 2 parts. And the lion's share of it is about the nature of God and the nature of divine stuff, just as an entity. And then the second half is the tail end of the book, and is what things are commanded and performed by God and what things people can do to attain perfection. Perfection does not mean you are a flawless person and you do everything right. Perfection is a philosophical term having to do with how connected into the idea of reason you are, your personal attributes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a complex idea. We'll come back to it a little bit. The lack of formal structure, Maimonides doesn't give chapter headings. He just kind of says chapter 72, chapter 73. The lack of structure is intentional. And we're going to see that the lack of structure is intentional. He talks about why he does this. Which way is right? Both and neither. I kind of feel like that's the rabbinic answer here, is both and neither. They're both right and neither one is right, because the structure is not what the book is about. And so if you're perplexed, that's good. I can't tell you that I'm going to guide you through the perplexity necessarily. And neither would Maimonides, by the way, which we'll see as well. Okay, so before we move on to who the guide is for, questions about any of that? Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
Is Maimonides talking about, is he talking about the Jewish God, or is he trying to be universal? I mean, he's saying revelation was to Moses, he is the prophet above all, but is this, could this be a perplexed non-Jew finding truth for themselves?
We're going to see that it's not, actually, that he is very specifically thinking of a particular kind of Jew.
But, okay. And does he cite Aristotle by name, and what does he think of
Oh,
the
yeah.
pagans?
He cites Aristotle by name. He will cite a number of Islamic philosophers and Islamic theologians, and he will cite the Talmud, and he will cite the Torah and the prophets and all kinds of other works. He will sometimes talk about entire classes of Islamic scholars or entire classes of Jewish scholars as a lump. And at that point, you get to ask whether he's actually accurately characterizing those folks. But he really has aimed this at a particular kind of Jew. he's not really thinking about non-Jews as being the target for this book, which we'll see through the introduction and some of the other materials. So who it's for, who is this book for? On the surface, it's for a very specific person. Rabbi Joseph, son of Rabbi Judah, who was a student of Maimonides, a one-to-one student. He knew this person personally. They lived in Fustat or Cairo, right? They had access to Maimonides personally. And he starts off this, the epistolary dedicatory by saying, "My honored pupil, Rabbi Joseph, may the rock guard you. Son of Rabbi Judah, may his repose be in paradise." So we know that Rabbi Joseph's father, Rabbi Judah, has died. And Maimonides starts to talk about Joseph's achievements. And he says, you know, you were studying with me, and when thereupon you read under my guidance texts dealing with the art of logic, my hopes fastened upon you. And I saw that you are one worthy to have the secrets of the prophetic books revealed to you so that you would consider in them that which perfect men ought to consider. I started teaching you math. You caught on to math pretty quickly. I started teaching you astronomy. You caught on to that. I started teaching you logic. And then I saw that you were really a person that could achieve enlightenment. And so I continued to work with you. And I have in italics, secrets of the prophetic books and that which perfect men ought to consider. So I have these philosophic pauses that I mentioned. In the philosophic pauses, part of what we'll do is open up what these lines are supposed to mean. So secrets of the prophetic books and that which perfect men ought to consider, he's not going to define here. They get dealt with later in the book. But this is really a thing to think about. Our general idea of how philosophy is supposed to work is that reason is available to all. Yeah, you have to train it, but reason should be available to all, and things can be proved through reason and through logic. And we're talking about the secrets of the prophetic books. So I've already said, I think if we've been telling it, when we tell you that Maimonides is a rationalist, that's not 100% true. And his secrets of the prophetic books is one clue that we have to something else happening here that's not just straight public philosophy. And that which perfect men ought to consider, we're still dealing with the philosophic idea of perfection, not the everything I do is perfect and I am a perfect human in every respect. So these are just terms that he's using, and we're not going to tease them out right now because they get dealt with later in more detail. Now, Joseph is perplexed. This is for Hamilton fans, the King George off on the side there. So Maimonides sees Joseph's potential and he says, thereupon, I began to let you see certain flashes and to give you certain indications. Then I saw that you demanded of me additional knowledge and asked me to make clear to you certain things pertaining to divine matters, to inform you of the intention of the mutakalimun, my macron over the U didn't stick, in this respect, and to let you know whether their methods were demonstrative, and if not, what art they belong to. This goes on for a while. As I also saw you had already acquired some smattering of this subject from people other than myself, you were perplexed, as stupefaction had come over you. Your noble soul demanded of you to find out acceptable words. So he's saying, I started to teach you logic, and I saw your potential. And once I saw your potential, I started to teach you a little bit about these prophetic secrets that I was talking about above. Just little bits and pieces. And you latched onto them and you asked for more information. And at the same time, we're living in the Arab world. We're living in a part of the Arab world. We're living in Cairo where there's funding and imperial sponsorship of Islamic and philosophical scholarship. And you encountered the mutakalimun, we'll say who those are, and you wanted to know about them too, because they seem to say things that were contrary to what you had been taught in studying the Torah. And you'd already been talking to people. So you came to me already schooled up in some way on some of this stuff. and you were confused and you were left dumbstruck. And what did you do? I need to know how to deal with what I've learned. So these flashes and indications, this is language that Maimonides is going to use throughout the guide, particularly in the introduction, to talk about what it is like to apprehend the real meaning of a biblical text. So people who have a meditation practice and in Buddhist meditation, there's times where people say that they have kind of broken through the physical piece of things and they've apprehended the universe as it is, and then it closes back up again. This is not unlike what Maimonides is talking about, which again should have you on notice that we're not actually talking about a strict rationalist work. So that's the flashes and indications, and he's going to go on and on and on about flashes and indications in the introduction. And then there's this term mutakalimun. So there is a school of Islamic thought. It's not really philosophy. It's not strictly theology, called kalam. Kalam means dialectical discussion of issues, essentially. The mutakalimun are the people who do kalam. But Maimonides is not talking about the Islamic version of this. There's a Jewish version of kalam. And Maimonides is saying, oh, you started reading the Jewish version of kalam, and that got you confused. And now you want answers. So he's going to talk about the mutakalimun. There's a section where he talks about them at length and arguably mischaracterizes them and never quotes any of them, which should put you on warning that maybe is not right. And then by extension, he's going to talk about Aristotelian philosophy, which he's getting in part from Aristotle translated into Arabic, but this person, Averroes Ibn Rushd, is his contemporary in the Islamic world. So his student has been encountering Islamic and Jewish philosophy and Islamic and Jewish theology, and each of those disciplines has a way of describing the world. Both Jewish and Islamic kalam believe that things in the world were made up of atoms. Maimonides thinks that's nuts. Maimonides was wrong. So that's kind of what he's dealing with, is another way of looking at the world that's not his. And he doesn't think highly of it. And so he's concerned to lead Joseph in the right direction in understanding kalam, the mutakalimun, and all of these other concepts. I knew you were confused, and now I'm writing this to help you not be so confused. But Maimonides didn't give Joseph the answers. He said, I tried to get you not to talk about all of this stuff and not to read this stuff and to do things in order, i.e. the order I fed them to you in, so that the truth will be established in your mind according to proper methods, and certainty should not come to you by accident. Whenever during your association with me a verse or some text of the sages was mentioned in which there was a pointer to some strange notion, I did not refrain from explaining it to you. So, certainty should not come by accident. I don't want you to get to the wrong answer and be convinced that you have the right answer. And pointer to some strange notion, we're going to see that Maimonides thinks that the prophets are supposed to be read a particular way. And he explained, when we hit something that was kind of weird, I explained it to you in the right way so that you would understand and so that you would not get confused about what something meant and think that the Torah is wrong or think that philosophy is wrong, right? He's trying to balance these two things. And Maimonides says, well, I didn't answer then, but you left. And so I wrote this and I'm sending it to you so that I can answer your questions, because I'm sure you're confused by this point still. So for you and those like you, however few they are, Maimonides is sort of signaling again, not a lot of people should really be exposed to this subject matter. In dispersed chapters. So this is interesting. Remember how I said that there's structure to the Guide of the Perplexed, but kind of not really? this is the kind of not really, is the topics are spread out all over the place. There isn't a particular single argument being made in a single thread. In fact, there are contradictions. And Maimonides is going to later, we'll see, actually tell you there are contradictions, and I put them in there on purpose. So you have to read the whole thing to start to understand what's going on with the book. And I did that intentionally. Essentially, Maimonides is admitting, because it's hard and there's no good place to start and end. Okay, so before we move on, who's perplexed? Or even if you're absolutely certain, do you have a question anyway?
I have a question anyway about the Mutakalamun.
Mm-hmm.
So you said this is, I just want to clarify, this isn't the group of Arab scholars who are called that. He's talking about a different.
So they are Arab scholars, but they're Jewish Arab scholars. So Kalam and the Mutakalimun start as an Islamic phenomenon,
Right.
and then it spreads into Jewish thought. And so when Maimonides is critiquing the Mutakalimun, he's primarily critiquing the Jewish version of it.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah, so there's actually a Wikipedia article called Jewish Kalam. And Kalam is K-A-L-A-M, as in Mary. So yeah, that's what he's up to.
This phrase, however few they are, is that just to make Joseph feel good, or is he really saying, I'm writing for a tiny handful of folk who can actually follow this?
He is really saying, I'm writing for a tiny handful of folk. And we'll see in the fuller introduction, this letter is kind of like a nutshell of what's going to come in the introduction. He really thinks there aren't that many people who are going to be able to comprehend this book. And so that we're 100% clear, he would include us in the set of people who should not be reading this book.
And
So,
in my case, rightly so. But
in all of our cases, rightly so, I think. But we'll get there. Michael, you have a hand up.
You mentioned that there are contradictions and that it's kind of purposely written in an obscure way, I guess, from the fact that it's written with contradictions. Now, I always thought that was because he was trying to obscure from others, authorities or others who might criticize him, what he was really saying, and so that only the super elite, namely the intended readers, would be able to know which things he said were true and which things he said were intentionally false. And I think he says that somewhere, that he says things that are true and things that are not true, but you, Joseph, or your people like you will know which is the truth and which is the not truth. But I always thought that was to some extent to protect himself from attack, because I don't know if at this point he'd been attacked, but he was certainly attacked in his lifetime for lots of things.
Yeah, so the idea of protection from attack is one of the legacies of Leo Strauss's Persecution of the Art of Writing, that he very much keys into Maimonides recognizing that he uses a line at some point, the butt of ignorant people or something, B-U-T-T, of ignorant people. And there is concern for that, but there's also a fairly attractive theory now that says there's other stuff going on, because Maimonides admits, yeah, sometimes you have to do this so that you cover up what people shouldn't know. But that's not the only reason he says he puts contradictions in. So some of the contradictions are there for a different reason. And some modern scholarship has worked on it and said that there's actually sort of an odd pluralism happening in the Guide of the Perplexed. That we'll actually get there, because it's the most recent scholarly theory. So whether it's right or not, I don't know, but it makes sense of a lot of things that otherwise don't work necessarily all that well together if you look at Maimonides and you think, well, he just wanted you to ignore half the book. There's something else going on, some scholars think. Okay, so moving to what kind of guidance is the guide? It's a guide. What kind of guidance does it give? Maimonides starts his introduction, so we're really now into the introduction. Maimonides starts the introduction by saying the first purpose of this treatise is to explain the meanings of certain terms occurring in books of prophecy. Some of these terms are equivocal, hence the ignorant attribute to them only one or some of the meanings in which the term in question is used. Others are derivative, hence they attribute to them only the meaning from which the other meaning is derived. Others are amphibulous. That's not a word you come across very often. Others are amphibulous terms, so that they are at times believed to be univocal and at other times equivocal. So since amphibulous is maybe a GRE word and not an SAT word, amphibulous means ambiguous in context. You can't even really sort it out in context, and it is susceptible to a lot of different possible meanings. It's not quite ambiguous. It's not quite straight ambiguous. It's slightly different. Maybe not different enough for us to worry about, but it does have a different definition in the dictionary than just ambiguous. It actually uses ambiguous in its definition and then kind of goes on. So what does he mean? The first purpose is to explain the meanings of certain terms occurring in books of prophecy. What does it mean to talk about Jacob's ladder? Do we really think that a ladder stretched from the ground at Bethel into the sky? Or does that mean something else? When we read Proverbs and we see a discussion of what seems to be a discussion of a woman with intemperate values, are we supposed to believe that that's what Proverbs is talking about, or does it mean something else? Maimonides is saying, essentially, many of the things in the Torah, many of the things in Tanakh, many of the things that the rabbis wrote mean more than one thing. And there's the surface level reading of it, and then there's the deeper level meaning of it. Ignorant people only get the surface level. You, Joseph, are not going to be an ignorant person. I'm going to show you how to figure out the other stuff. Because you have to deal with a text that has non-natural phenomena occurring. And what does it mean that non-natural phenomena are talked about in a text? Could it possibly be true? Maimonides is suggesting maybe yes, maybe no. And he says, I have the key to help you understand these problems that you're having because you've studied philosophy, you've become a more rationally informed person, and you're trying to figure out what you do with these very irrational seeming texts and these very irrational seeming rules. So that's what he's starting to get at. We are for real only, like, this is only the first 2 sentences of the introduction. So you can see why we're just doing the introduction for a session. Who should read this? Probably not us. It is not the purpose of this treatise to make its totality understandable to the vulgar or to beginners in speculation. So if you're not a philosophy professor, please turn around now. Nor to teach those who have not engaged in any study other than the science of the law. I mean the legalistic study of the law. For the purpose of this treatise and all of those like it, it is the science of law in its true sense. So vulgar or beginners in speculation, uneducated people, people who are new to philosophy, this is not for them. They don't have the discernment necessary. The legalistic study of the law, we're talking about the yeshivaniks. Maimonides would not have used the word yeshivanik because he didn't speak Yiddish to start with, so yeshivanik is not a thing he'd say. But he's talking about the people who are in yeshivas and they're studying Torah and they're not studying anything else, and their entire world is framed by study of the Talmud. He would almost certainly lump Rashi into this group. Right? So Rashi is plebeian, and that's part of that tablet article that I showed you earlier. and then the law in its true sense. Again, there's a real meaning underneath all of these seemingly irrational words, and I'm going to teach you how to find them. But we probably shouldn't be reading this. So let's all go home. I'm kidding. Wait, we are home. It's a quarantine, right? Turn off your computer. Okay. Maimonides continues, or rather, he's now saying, rather, its purpose, the purpose of the guide, is to give indications to a religious man for whom the validity of our law has become established in his soul and has become actual in his belief. Such a man being perfect in his religion and character, and having studied the science of the philosophers and come to know what they signify. The human intellect having drawn him on and led him to dwell within its province, he must have felt distressed by the internals of the law and by the meanings of the above mentioned equivocal, derivative, or amphibolious terms, there's that word again, as he continued to understand them by himself or was made to understand them by others. This is a mouthful. Everything is a mouthful in this, because they took this Arabic text and then they made the translation even more highfalutin, because that's how you translated texts in the 1960s. So what's he talking about? Perfect understanding, mature, full kind of understanding of Torah is what he's talking about here. The science of the philosophers and what they signify. So he's essentially saying you studied Greek philosophy and you understand that Greek philosophy, as conveyed to us through Arabic literature, Greek philosophy is getting at universal truths too, T-O-O. And now you're distressed because philosophy seems to say a certain set of things are true. The Torah seems to say another set of things are true, and they don't match up. And you're left trying to figure out which one is right. Boy, have I got a book for you, is what Maimonides is saying. And the book is my book. Maimonides says, I know I'm addressing a specific kind of person and a particular kind of confusion. Hence, he would remain in a state of perplexity and confusion as to whether he should follow his intellect, renounce what he knew, and consider that he has renounced the foundation of the law, or he should hold fast to his understanding of these terms and not let himself be drawn on together with his intellect, rather turning his back on it and moving away from it, while at the same time perceiving he brought loss to himself and harm to his religion. He would be left with those imaginary beliefs to which he owes his fear and difficulty, and would not cease to suffer from heartache and great perplexity. He's confused. Philosophy and Torah don't match. Should I follow my intellect and reject the Torah, having come to a higher realization, or should I reject philosophy? If I reject philosophy, I now have to live with the knowledge that I wasted time studying philosophy, and that maybe I'm less well off for having done so, because philosophy is counter to what the Torah says, and I have to accept the Torah, so the philosophy has to go out the window. I wasted all this time, and it's permanently damaged the way I think about things. Right? This is really where Maimonides is going, is you're left trying to figure this out. I recognize the kind of confusion you have. I'm going to help you. I have to tell you, the text is not super helpful, really. It's not an advice book. It's very much its own thing. So this is what he's trying to say, is I know you're confused. I taught you all this philosophy. I didn't do it so that I would degrade your commitment to Jewish life, and I didn't do it so that you would waste your time studying philosophy. So I need to help you fix this problem that you have. And I have another purpose. My other purpose is to explain very obscure parables occurring in the books of the prophets, but not expressly identified as such there. Books of the prophets here is the entire Tanakh. By the way, he's not just talking about the prophetic literature that's in the prophets section of the Tanakh. He's talking about the whole thing. An ignorant or heedless individual might think they possess only an external sense and no internal one. However, even when one who truly possesses knowledge considers, these parables and interprets them according to their external meaning, he too is overtaken by great perplexity. Again, was there really a ladder going from Bethel on the ground up to heaven with angels going up and down it? Is that what we're saying? But if we explain these parables and draw his attention to their being parables, he will take the right road and be delivered from this perplexity. That is why I have called this treatise the Guide of the Perplexed. So now we know why it's called the Guide of the Perplexed. We are no more unperplexed than we were before. We are still perplexed. We're supposed to be perplexed, by the way, because we're still in the introduction. So the books of the prophets, he's talking about the entire Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, all the other writings. And very obscure parables are sometimes biblical stories that people have come to kind of readily know and recite. Do we really think that the Red Sea split when Moses held up a staff and Nachshon put his foot in the water? Well, not really. Do we really think there was a ladder going up and down from heaven? Not really. Do we really think that Elijah was taken up into heaven by a chariot? Because that's what happened to Elijah, supposedly. No, we don't think that. So Maimonides is saying there's a level that you read the stuff at and you go, okay, this is what happened. And that's not really, really, really what the book is trying to say. That's not really what the Torah is trying to get at. It's not really what the prophets are trying to get at. It's this other deeper meaning. And I'm going to help you unconfuse yourself. You should be perplexed. You personally should be perplexed. So if you are, that's good. If you're not, maybe you've done this before. Laura, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I was just remembering your presentation on Spinoza, and I was just remembering that he also was trying to deal with those parables and images that sounded hard to believe from a more rationalist perspective. And if I remember correctly, in the treatise that you had discussed, his approach was more like, well, it's not it was the fault of the translators or the people who wrote the text who actually didn't write things the right way, and so what we are reading is not the real text, and now Maimonides is also faced with the same kind of issues, but he has a different approach to it. But in a way, there is some similarity in them both trying to wrestle with how to take those parts of the Torah that seem hard to swallow.
Yeah, as I was reading this, I was thinking, oh yeah, like in Spinoza where he blah, 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 blah. So that is a really good link to make, because to some extent, this is what Spinoza thought he was doing, was a somewhat similar project, at least in that particular work, the theological political tractate. He thought he was trying to kind of explain what happens to the biblical texts in terms of transmission, in terms of meaning, in terms of vocabulary. And he's more willing to say, oh yeah, that's just wrong. Or we can find natural explanations for the things that happen, because he really doesn't reject, he never says, oh, the walls of Jericho didn't fall down. That's silly. You can't do that with horns, which is what this story, you can't do that by walking around a city 7 times and then blowing a horn. That's not how you knock the walls of a city down. Spinoza actually doesn't question the historical veracity of that, but he thinks maybe it's getting at something else. Maimonides maybe sometimes seems to think that actually maybe that didn't happen, but something else is happening. Yeah, Ami.
Yeah, the thing that I see different between Maimonides and Spinoza is, at least I didn't get the impression from Spinoza that he is telling you the way it is. He said what he think it is, and and I guess he expects you to listen to him, but he's not taking the position that I know and you don't know, and you listen to me. That was my impression.
Yeah, so he doesn't have that kind of introduction that Maimonides has, where he's saying, I can help you here. Maimonides, however, is about to say farther into the introduction, but I'm going to tell you things that disagree with themselves. So there's a particular way you should go about reading it, because I can't give you the answers. So this is actually really crucial. It's called the Guide of the Perplexed, but Maimonides actually says, I'm not going to give you an explanation. So there's something else happening with the book. It's not about, here is how it is. It sounds like that's what he's going to do, but it's actually not his project. And you kind of have to work more into the introduction and more into the rest of the book to see that he doesn't actually try to give you straight answers. And he actually acknowledges that he can't, which is interesting for somebody who's supposed to be fixing your confusion. Okay, so don't expect a full resolution. Oh, Larry.
I can certainly understand explaining a ladder, the text, there was a ladder to heaven, as this was a metaphor, it wasn't really so. But I can't understand the text that says, this is a message for everyone, or at least for all the Jews, and among my messages is the story that Noah took 2 of each kind onto the ark, and he took 7 of each kind onto the ark. If this is supposed to be for the masses, it is, it's difficult to believe that that is anything but a contradiction on simple facts. It's not something miraculous like parting the Red Sea. It says A is X and it says A is Y.
So Maimonides actually categorizes contradictions. We'll actually see his list of contradictions. He actually identifies 7 kinds of contradictions that appear in works, and he tells you biblical texts have certain contradictions in them.
Right. But does he comment on, this is the law for everyone, this is the message for everyone, I am the Lord your God, I have a covenant with all of Israel? Does he explain that?
So he comments on it. Much of what's actually happening in the text of the guide is biblical commentary in the guise of a philosophic book, which is part of why another reason that I kind of brought up that article from Tablet, because the article in Tablet is essentially saying Maimonides is the counter tradition to traditional interpretation as we come to associate it with traditional study of the Torah. So yeah, he does actually go into all of this to help deperplexify people. That's not a real word, but you know what I mean. Joyce.
So I keep thinking with what he's trying to do, it just reminds me, for whatever reason, of Reconstructionist Judaism. Like you're taking the Torah and you're kind of putting a new spin, for lack of a better word, onto it.
Yeah, so Maimonides' approach is a whole lot weirder, I think. Or at least is a lot weirder than what Reconstructionism should be on paper. What Reconstructionism is in real life is its own weird thing. But Reconstructionism on paper is actually far more rationalist than Maimonides, which that's going to be a little bit of a puzzle, but we'll see how it works out. Okay. So he's saying, he comes right out here and says, I'm not telling you that I'm going to remove all the difficulties, assuming you understand it. It will remove most of them and those of the greatest moment, right? So the stuff that's really bothering you, I can help you work through from your study of it, not because I'm handing you an answer. A sensible man should not demand of me or hope that when we mention a subject, we'll make a complete exposition. I'm not going to tell you everything. How then should it be put down in writing without becoming the butt for every ignoramus, right? So people are ignorant and I actually can't trust them to get this right. I've got to make the text complex to avoid that problem. We have already explained in our legal compilations, the Mishnah Torah, which we looked at a little bit last week in the kind of overview to Maimonides, but you don't need to know that to do this. Thus, we have mentioned there in our legal works that the account of the beginning, Ma'aseh Bereshit, is identical with natural science, and the account of the chariot, Ma'aseh Merkava, with the divine science, and have explained the rabbinic saying the account of the chariot ought not to be taught even to one man, except if he be wise and able to understand by himself, in which case only the chapter headings may be transmitted to him. So Maimonides is essentially saying, I'm giving you secret teachings. I'm giving you secret mystical teachings, in fact, right? So when people say Maimonides is a rationalist, really? He's teaching Merkava mysticism. I have deemed you, Joseph, and people who should be reading this, I can't control who reads it, but the people who should be reading it, I'm going to teach you what I am permitted to teach you of mystical speculation on creation. That's what Ma'aseh Bereshit is referring to. And Ma'aseh Merkava, mystical speculation of the divine chariot. So what is God? That's Ma'aseh Merkava. So Maimonides is really saying, I'm going to give you these little hints so that you, having had the philosophical background and the Torah background, can tease out and fix some of the problems that you've been experiencing when you feel these contradictions between Torah and philosophy. Maimonides is doing something that is not particularly what we think of philosophy as doing, which is trying to teach mysticism a little bit as a means of fixing confusion about Torah versus what at the time would have been science, right? So when he writes the Mishnah Torah, this legal code, he incorporates Greek science into the beginning of it. And he actually makes it like Jewish law. Greek science is Jewish law, right? The structure of the heavens as understood by Ptolemy, guess what? That's Jewish law for Maimonides. And he's making reference to what he did in that text here. And then he's saying, I'm going to teach you the actual mysticism stuff. And I'm going to teach it to you in the way that the Talmud says I should teach it to you, which is I'm going to give you little hints and you'll be able to work your way through it. So I'm not going to give you an explanation. I am going to give you hints. The hints I'm going to give you are not philosophy necessarily. So when you come to the Guide of the Perplexed and people tell you Maimonides is a rationalist, I'm telling you, yeah, but. And the yeah, but is a strict rationalist doesn't do Kabbalah and doesn't do Merkava mysticism. So I can't tell. So I know Ami has a virtual hand up. I see Laura and Joyce as well. I don't know whose hands are real, but Ami is unmuted, so Ami.
You want me to start? Well, I don't want to argue with people who have learned it much harder and longer than I have. But when you say Ma'aseh Merkava, I wouldn't have translated it as a chariot. Merkava really means assembly of something. That makes a whole lot more sense, that you assemble things together.
Yeah. I mean, the translation, what ends up happening is that word gets translated in English when it's talking about mysticism as the divine chariot, right? Because it's what it ends up thinking about is really, it's speculation on the book of Ezekiel, essentially. The opening of the book of Ezekiel where he has this vision in the temple and, you know, there's this chariot that God is sitting on, and it's got wheels in each direction and a different animal head in each direction. And what does that all mean? That's kind of the foundation of Merkava mysticism. And assembly works just as well. I'm using the phrase divine chariot essentially because when you go into English language sources on this, that's what they call it. So, you know, you have to have something to be able to go look it up in Encyclopedia Judaica, and that's part of how you find it in the index, I guess. But yeah, it's not the best translation, but, you know, neither is Beth Chai, for what it's worth. Okay, so what kind of philosophy are we dealing with here if we're talking about what is essentially Jewish mystical doctrine? You should not think that these great secrets, sodim, so sod is the word for secrets. He works in Hebrew into the Arabic all over the place. You should not think these great secrets are fully and completely known to anyone among us. They are not. But sometimes the truth flashes out to us so that we think that it is day, and then matter and habit in their various forms conceal it, so we find ourselves in an obscure night. We are like someone in a very dark night over whom lightning flashes time and again, so that he is always, as it were, in unceasing light. Thus night appears to him as day. That is the degree of the great one among the prophets. This is Moses, to whom it was said, as for thee, stand thou here by me. Okay, so this is, Moses is living under the lightning flashes of realizing what's true. And there's so many lightning flashes that he can see clear as day. Among them, there is one to whom the lightning flashes only once in the whole of his night. So in his life, he has one great flash and prophesies. There are others between whose lightning flashes there are greater or shorter intervals. People who kind of putz around through life, and then they have these moments of brief enlightenment, but not full illumination by the lightning flash. He's kind of putting these people in tears. And then there are people who attain no illumination by lightning flash, but are illumined by a polished body or something of that kind, right? So a stone that's reflecting light from the lightning, right? These are successively farther removed from true understanding of the divine nature. And even this small light that shines over us is not always there, but flashes and is hidden again, as if it were the flaming sword which turned every way. It is in accord with these states that the degrees of the perfect vary. So there are different layers, different levels of understanding these divine secrets. And my job is to give you not my job, but Maimonides' job is to give you tools to work your way as high up the ladder as you can get. So secrets, the use of the word sod is another one of these mysticism alerts. Sod is one of the 10 sephirot, the 10 kind of vessels of the divine that exist in Jewish mysticism, right? So Sod is the deepest one. So there's charged stuff happening with his language that's not about philosophy. And great one among the prophets, we said, is Moses. So Moses knew it all. Everybody seems to agree Moses knew it all. He is under the lightning like it's daylight. Very complex array of who's who in the universe. But it's not fully rational. So that's a thing to consider. Maimonides says, I obscured this on purpose. If you wish to grasp the totality of what this contains so that nothing will escape you, then you must connect its chapters one with another. You therefore should not let our fantasies elaborate on what is said here, for that would hurt me and be of no use to you. You ought rather to learn everything that ought to be learned and constantly study this treatise. You don't start on page 1 and have me build an argument for you, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5. You have to continually read this thing, and your continued exposure to this book will help you sort through your confusions. And don't tell anybody else. I adjure every reader of this treatise of mine not to comment, that should be comment, upon a single word of it, and not to explain to another anything in it, save what has been explained and commented upon in the words of the famous sages of our law who preceded me. If I mention a piece of Talmud, you can talk about the piece of Talmud, but don't say what I said about the piece of Talmud. But whatever he understands of those things have not been said by any of our famous sages other than myself, should not be explained to another. Don't tell them what I said, nor should he hasten to refute me, for that which he understood me to say might be contrary to my intention. Don't quote me. Also, don't argue about me in public, because you might have it wrong, because I'm writing contradictions into this book. If anything in it, according to his way of thinking, appears to be in some way harmful, he should interpret it, even if in a far-fetched way, in order to pass a favorable judgment. So when Michael was talking about the idea that he intentionally made it obscure because he knew he could get in trouble, this passage is part of where that idea has some roots. And it's not that it's wrong. It's not wrong. It's just not the only thing happening in the book. But he's essentially saying, please don't talk about my work. I could get in trouble. That's a little bit of a problem, but actually I'm in charge of the Jewish community in Egypt. So how much trouble am I going to get in? I'm in charge here. By this time, he's in charge. But also, you might misunderstand, other people might misunderstand. We've talked about how regular people don't understand this stuff, so you really shouldn't expose them to it, because you can lead less well-educated people astray. So don't do that. Don't talk to them about it. Just like I'm only talking to you, Joseph, about these mystical things, and I'm only giving you chapter headings. Maimonides then talks about how books are contradictory, and he gives a list. And he actually did. I don't quote everything, but I'm giving you the summary of the list. A collection of statements compiled from different sources, but you don't do a good job citing the sources, right? You did a bad job with your book report, and we can't tell what you wrote, and we can't tell what was in the book. An opinion held at the beginning is rejected at the end, but the author leaves them in. This is, by the way, like pure Talmud. So is number 1, by the way. Some statements are to be read for their surface meaning, others not, parables, etc. And then you have to know what's a parable and what's not. 2 subjects differ and one hasn't been fully elucidated, so the contradiction is resolved. Okay, so this is where, so Larry was asking, okay, so is it 2 animals or 7? What's the deal here? And Maimonides might say, well, you know, it's not clear, there's something happening, we don't have the answer. It's not fully expressed. Number 5, the need for teaching and the obscurity of the subject compels the author to write things that appear contradictory, but the reason is for framing the ideas in ways different readers. This is essentially, okay, I'm trying to teach 5 different people and they each are going to understand this a different way. So I got to give 5 different explanations as analogies, and the analogies don't match up. That's number 5. The contradiction is concealed and only identified after laborious reading, sometimes intentionally, often not. So this is Maimonides saying, you know, scholars, you can get so far ahead of yourselves that you write yourself into a contradiction, you don't even realize it. And he actually says scholars do this. And then the last one, in speaking about very obscure matters, it is necessary to conceal some parts and disclose others. In such cases, the vulgar must in no way, great typo, must in no way be aware of the contradiction. The author accordingly uses some device to conceal it by all means. And this is the, I'm hiding the secrets, so that if a regular person, an Am Haaretz, an ignorant person picks up my book, they can't actually figure out what I'm talking about. And he says, divergences are to be found in this treatise are due to the 5th cause. I'm trying to teach it to a lot of people in different ways, so I'm going to say things that don't match up because they're analogies. And the 7th, I'm hiding things. Know this, grasp its true meaning, and remember it well so as not to become perplexed by some of its chapters. You have to keep this reading key in mind. You have to always be thinking about, am I giving you a contradiction here because I'm trying to teach the same thing in a different way? Or am I giving you a contradiction here because I know that you, as a person of wisdom, can suss out what's actually supposed to happen, and I'm trying to keep regular people from apprehending what I'm saying. That's number 7. That's the 7th one. And Maimonides is saying, I'm doing both. And I'm telling you up front, I'm doing both. You need to read this book understanding what I'm doing, because otherwise you'll just be more confused, and that's not my goal. You didn't think that there was going to be so much out of an introduction, did you? Usually an introduction is like, I need to thank my research assistant and my editor and my spouse who put up with all of my late nights, and that's the usual introduction. That's not this introduction. Maimonides, I'm not sure Maimonides ever really mentions much of his family. His brother talked about a lot, but he must have mentioned his wife at some point, but I don't know that I've read it. And certainly not in the acknowledgments to the guide. So that was a lot. You're probably perplexed or confused. If there are questions that you can frame in your perplexity, let's see what we can do about questions. Or are we so dumbstruck that we can't even frame the questions, which, to be fair, could happen.
Well, I mean, it's hard to imagine after reading that introduction how you can get anything out of this, because he's saying, well, I put in some contradictions on purpose. I made stuff obscure for various reasons. I might try to explain the same thing. I mean, it just now, I'm exhausted thinking about reading it. I don't know if that's a common feeling.
That's a very common feeling. I mean, remember, the English language introduction to a translation was 123 pages long. So, and that's a guy who studied Maimonides for half of his life. That's his introduction to a translation. It's not even his translation. He's not the guy who did the translating. He's the guy giving you the introduction. He's saying, oh, I have 123 pages of discussion before you should even read the first page of the actual text, right? It is intentionally difficult to read. It's aimed at somebody who's already going to know how to get to the answers Maimonides thinks they should be getting to. And part of what Maimonides is trying to do, and he does say this, at least in relatively clear language, is Maimonides is saying, I'm trying to make it so that you who have gone through the study of the law and now have gone through the study of philosophy hold both. And not hold both in tension, but are able to hold both and to understand that they are actually coextensive in a lot of ways, which on their surface, they aren't. So a lot of the work that Maimonides is doing is very confusing. He's aimed at a particular kind of person, and there are very few of those people. I suspect really there are none of those people today, because nobody actually takes seriously the idea that Aristotle's view of the universe is like, matches up with physics in every respect.
Right.
So that's part of the problem, is there are no people like this. Not anymore. There weren't that many to begin with, and he knows that. Roberto, you have a hand up.
Yes. So I haven't seen, and I'm sure that we're going to delve right when you go into the text, but I haven't seen from introduction that it's not necessarily the affirmation that not being a rational approach, right? I think even the fact that being mystical, I mean, remembering that he's trying to reconcile here rational thinking with the stories of the Torah, right? I mean, I think it's kind of almost unavoidable that it's going to be some element of mysticism involved. I don't know if, again, it's going to be at which level, right? I know that those things are in part coexisting in time, right? In different regions, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know how deep he's going to go into that. But again, from what I'm seeing, I think it's pretty impressive, at least, that the fact that he's questioning the veracity of those stories being told in the Torah and not being more a allegoric meaning of something else by itself. I think for someone on the 12th century to say that, I mean, it's more surprising how he wouldn't be excommunicated by making those statements, right? And I know that even not this book, as we talked the last time, but his other work is was, after all, well accepted, right, into the mainstream at some
Yeah.
point.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that's kind of,
yeah.
I mean, I'm curious to see exactly how those things are going to translate into the actual content. But again, I still don't see necessarily there is a problem of that, stating that as rational, right? At least what rational meant in the 12th century. So,
Right. One of the problems becomes that we have this idea of what rationalist is. Maimonides is, I think it's fair to say, comparatively rational, right? Maimonides is not going to say, oh, well, you know, the universe was created in such and such a way, and oh yes, you know, some of the absurdities that come up in Rashi's commentary and Midrash, he doesn't really accept as being true. He thinks they're parables. He's willing to turn an awful lot of stuff into parables to make it still work, which is interesting. But I think it's important as well to point something out about Jewish mysticism that maybe we don't easily recognize because we hear the word mysticism and we think, you know, people sitting around with incense and, you know, in caves or whatever, and that's not necessarily what Jewish mysticism is about. By me. Jewish mysticism and most Near Eastern, Middle Eastern mysticism of the medieval period is actually built off of Greek philosophy. So a lot of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, is built off of Neoplatonic philosophy from the 3rd century. Right? It's Greek philosophy that then gets religious form slapped onto it in some ways. So even mysticism has its own internal logic and rationale to it. But the idea that, okay, we're going to take philosophy and actually I'm going to tell you that there are secret meanings, that's very not what you think philosophy is going to be, even in this time period. So there is this other piece of what Maimonides is doing that's not typical even for Jewish philosophers. And that's the piece that is particularly challenging. When you know that piece of it, it makes it challenging to read the text because now you're looking for all these contradictions and you can't be sure what's the right answer. So that's a big part of the complication here, I think. And because we don't live steeped in the environment and the learning that he thinks you're supposed to be steeped in, it's even harder for us at a remove to then analyze it the way he thinks we should. It's a little, so I'm saying it's a little odd for a rationalist. And Maimonides doesn't necessarily seem to be saying that reason is the way you identify and understand truth. And there are a couple of different modern explanations for this. So Leo Strauss, this big introduction to his book, and then Persecution in the Art of Writing, the separate book that he wrote, says ultimately Maimonides recognizes that not all of the answers are rational. He knows he can't actually prove the existence of God, even though he's got a proof for the existence of God. He knows he can't prove that. He knows he can't prove that the Torah is true, even though he's got a proof for it. So he realizes that the formal logic doesn't work. And when you look at Kalam, Jewish and Islamic Kalam, this sort of dialectical thought thing that precedes Maimonides, many of the assumptions are unprovable as well, right? You just have to take it on faith. The syllogisms break as soon as you kind of look at them because you go, you can't prove that. So ultimately what's happening isn't rational. That's Strauss's take on it. Moshe Halbertal, whose intellectual biography of Maimonides I kind of talked about last week a little bit. So Moshe Halbertal does something interesting in his biography, which he actually spends most of it talking about something other than the guide. He spends it talking about Maimonides as a person. He spends more than half the book talking about the Mishnah Torah, which is an interesting way of recentering Maimonides' life if you're a philosophy professor, which is what he is. But Halbertal says, you know, actually there's 4 things happening in the guide. And when you look at it that way, you get a little bit more of an understanding of why there might be contradictions. And he says there's kind of 4 layers. There's a skeptical level, a mystical level, a conservative level, and a philosophical level, or themes. And essentially what he's saying is, Maimonides writes these contradictions in because he knows he has to catch the reader where they are. And so there are going to be readers who come to it with deep skepticism because of where they are in their intellectual development, and he needs to shore those people up. And so he's going to provide rational arguments that feed them to then bring them back into a more balanced alignment from his perspective. There are going to be mystical ones, these, parables and what's the true meaning of this, that people who need that appeal to rebalance them. There are going to be people who are religiously conservative who you've got to then pull them back toward reason by giving them the conservative stuff that they need, where you're saying, yeah, this is accurate, this is accurate, this is accurate. And then there are going to be philosophical people who you can do a little bit of both, and you can bring them along so that it's actually a text that's intended to hit you where you are as you read it and to help you reorient. And you keep reading it. He says, keep going back to it, because he realizes that his readers are not going to stay in one place in their thought. And they're going to hit a different thing each time, and that's going to bring them back around to where they ought to be. And after they've read it once, they can go back to the parts and kind of recalibrate. So that's kind of what Halbertal is arguing. This is kind of the most recent grand theory of Maimonides. What Halbertal is really saying is, you can read this text and think that it's trying to hide the ball to keep it from common people, and it is. And you can read it as hiding the ball from people who've only studied Torah, and it is. But it's also doing a constructive thing, and the constructive thing it's doing is providing a number of different ways to deal with some of the contradictions. And he starts talking, so Halbertal actually lists out a bunch of these contradictions. He says, how can you reconcile the spirit of part 3, chapter 51, which describes the redemption of the philosopher's soul, with chapter 54, which tells the philosopher's return to worldly life after coming to recognize all he can know about God are his actions in the world as it exists? So how can the philosopher be saved in chapter 51? The philosopher's soul be saved in chapter 51, but in chapter 54, we're talking about somebody who realizes that actually I can't know any of this, right? So he's pointing to all of these tensions throughout the work and saying, actually, it's got these contradictions and these tensions on purpose. And it's to find you where you are and make it work where you are and for who you are at the time that you're reading it. And that will change every time you read it. And that helps take it out of just the I'm hiding the ball to hide the ball for people who shouldn't be reading it, and gives it somewhat of a more constructive read. And Maimonides is very clear. I was very, very careful with every word that I used. And if we go back to these 7 contradictions, Maimonides says he only has 2 of them in there. He says, I only use 5 and 7. All the other ones aren't in here. Now, is that really true? No, of course, he's probably screwed stuff up because we're human and we put contradictions in that we don't see. But he thinks he got them all. So that he's only really doing 5. I'm giving you multiple examples. And 7, I'm hiding the ball a little bit for people who shouldn't be reading this. He thinks that's what he's accomplished. This gets you only part of the way there to putting the book together as a whole. But if you think about, different ways of teaching the same thing, different ways of hitting you where you are, it makes a little bit more, it pulls a little bit more out of it, which is kind of what Halbertal's argument is that actually this is doing a really big thing, and it's hard to see what the big thing is until you realize what he's doing. It's a much more constructive approach to Maimonides than he's trying to hide the ball because he's afraid he's going to get persecuted, which is kind of what's the core of some of Strauss's argument. And some earlier mid-20th century ways of viewing Maimonides and the guide in particular. So I leave you with this question. Is Maimonides a rationalist with limits or something else? You can't answer it right now. You probably won't be able to answer it at the end of next week. But I want to make sure we're thinking about this, because it makes Maimonides a little bit less of a caricature. The rationalist we've all been taught about, the person of science, he's a theologian. He's not just a person of science. You have to buy into some pretty irrational stuff to be able to do theology the way that Maimonides is going to do it. So to think about Maimonides more totally, and also to be thinking about, to the extent Maimonides might have some things that are precursors to modern rationalist approaches to Judaism, it's useful for us to take steps back at times and to think, well, we think we're rational, are we? And what does that look like? What does it look like if we acknowledge that some of our predispositions, how we got to humanistic Judaism, what humanistic Judaism believes and thinks, maybe that's not all rational either. We like to think it is, but sometimes maybe it's not. We're here because we have emotional affect and we feel a particular way too. So that's why I kind of lift this particular piece about Maimonides up, is we should be self-critical in this stuff for us too, which is about the best explanation I can ever hope to find for why modern Jews should actually study Maimonides. Because goodness knows it's not for his view of an earth-centric universe that should be halacha. That's not a great reason. Questions, comments, concerns? Please don't feel like you got to go buy the $70 2-volume set of Maimonides, because I have to tell you, I don't open it that often.
Jeremy?
Yes.
So just who was the community in Alexandria or Cairo at that time? I mean, we know that it's an ancient community. Do we know, who they were, how many they were, and how disseminated did he intend this work to be?
So I don't have demographic stuff. I do know that by this point in time, he's actually running the Jewish community in Cairo. So he has some kind of cover for what he's publishing. I think he knows that the book is going to get wider circulation, because he does admit in the introduction, you and other people like you. I know it's going to get broadly circulated. I'd wish it wouldn't be, but I guess it's going to be, because look, I'm Maimonides. I mean, he does have some understanding of how important he is even then. And he knows that people are already fighting over the Mishnah Torah and all this other stuff. So we don't know for sure that he knows that it's going to get published when he issues it. However, we have that letter with Samuel ibn Tibbon, who writes to say, I'd really like to come visit you to talk through this stuff because I'm translating your Guide of the Perplexed into Hebrew. So while he may not have been thinking about it at first when he issued it, certainly by the time he's corresponding with Samuel ibn Tibbon, he knows he's got a big audience. So it might not have been intended initially for a wide publication, but that's what happened. And you have to imagine that he kind of could have foreseen that, particularly because he's working with someone to translate it into Hebrew, for which there's no need if you don't want to have it more widely publicized. And it should be said that over the course of, the 800 years since the guide appeared, very few people have encountered it in Arabic. That, Arabic reading Jews didn't necessarily engage with it all that often, but there's lots of Hebrew copies, and that's how people ended up reading it, was in Hebrew, and then, translation into other modern languages over time. And you wouldn't want to use the Ibn Tibbon, if you're a modern Hebrew speaker and reader, you wouldn't want to use the Ibn Tibbon translation today as your translation into Hebrew, because it's not your Hebrew. It's medieval quasi-rabbinic Hebrew. Other questions? Okay, so next time we'll actually look at stuff in the chapters, because we worked through the introduction to kind of get our get the right lenses on, to then start looking at some of the more well-known pieces of the guide, the stuff about negative theology, what you say about the divine, you're actually saying the inverse, but you're doing it in a positive assertion way because that's how people talk. We'll look at some of that and some of his discussion of prophecy, because he does think prophecy happened and there's different levels of it. And a lot of that does, as Laura pointed out, a lot of it sounds like Spinoza. Spinoza's project wasn't necessarily original as a project so much as it was original in his conclusions. Okay, I am going to hit the stop record button. Thank you everybody for coming.